You ever have one of those moments when your whole life changes and no one even hears it break? No gunshot. No scream. Just the sound of a small thing slipping away and the slow rearrangement of everything that came before it. That was mine. A cheap bracelet. A splash. And a man who moved through the shadows like he belonged there. My name is Clara. I'm 28. A single mother. And I clean other people's houses, so my daughter, Ella, can have crayons and cereal and a room that smells like soap. When the agency called about the job at the Voss estate, I told myself it was just another week. Maybe too deep clean. Stay out of the way. Do the laundry. Collect the paycheck. The description was sparse, discreet, efficient. The kind of words people use when they don't want anyone to ask questions. Ella came with me after school. She loved new places. The way some people love new books. All wide eyes and small. Constant chatter. She carried her little backpack like it was armor, and the bracelet she made at school like it was treasure. Pink paint smudged across a bead, where she'd written Mom, plus M-E, in the kind of messy, earnest script only 7-year-olds can produce. The house was the kind of quiet that pretends there's no history in the walls, marble that held the winter air colder than it should be, a pool that gleamed like glass, and a stillness that made my pulse sound loud in my ears. Ella ran her fingers along the pool tiles, laughing at the way her reflection looked smaller and funnier in the water. I told her not to lean too far. She rolled her eyes at me the way children do when they know the rules, but prefer mischief. Then the bracelet slipped. It was the smallest sound, nothing more than a soft plunk, but the way her face changed, like someone had emptied a pocket of sunlight, made my stomach drop. She leaned out, eyes wide, pleading. Mom. Eat Feline? I remember the reflex protect. Soothe. Make it right. Leave it. Baby. I said. Because sometimes the easiest answer is the one that stops the crying. She didn't understand value the way I did. $5 is money to me and infinity to her. She sniffled and looked at the water, as if the bracelet had become a new kind of hole in the world. That's when I felt it, that prickling along the back of the neck that tells you someone is watching. I turned, probably a second too slow. And there he was. He didn't make a sound coming up the terrace. Didn't announce himself as some men do with keys jingling or shoes scuffing. He simply existed at the edge of the sunlight. A man shaped to command a room, dark shirt. Sleeves rolled, the kind of casual that's been rehearsed to look effortless. He looked at Ella, at the bracelet, glinting at the bottom of the pool, and then at me. His eyes measured, and in them was the kind of calm that unsettles you, the calm that comes from being sure of everything, including yourself. What's wrong? He asked. Voice low and quiet. The kind of voice that carries miles. Nothing. Sire. My daughter dropped something. I said. My voice was small when I said it aloud. He walked toward the pool, each step deliberate, as if he were obeying some private metronome. He crouched and watched the water ripple. The sunlight, cutting his jaw like a blade. He didn't look at me when he said, "You could leave it." I told her we would. I replied too quickly. It's nothing important. That was a lie. To me it was everything. To Ella, it was the thing she'd made on a Wednesday afternoon and refused to take off. To him it was an excuse to watch my hands tremble. Ella watched him the way children do, when they meet characters from stories wide. Unguarded. Convinced. Magic is real. He glanced up and said, "Do you want it back, no?" I said because the right thing to say felt obvious, in that 1-second moral calculus. Protect the child from the man. It's fine. He smiled. Not much of a smile. More of a tilt at the corner of his mouth. Like he'd been keeping something private. Then come get it. I froze. It sounded like a question, and a command rolled into one. I should have grabbed for a net. Should have told Ella to go wait in the car. Should have run. Instead I moved. I folded down my sleeves. Reached. And leaned over the pool. The water was colder than the sun promised. It bit, he murmured. Almost gently. Careful. My fingers brushed the bracelet. Then the water pushed it away. Like the world conspiring to keep that small, bright thing from me. I looked up, and he was closer. As if he decided to close the distance between us. I'll get the net, I whispered. Though there were no nets in luxury houses. It seems. He tilted his head, watching me, and said, "Oh, you could just step in. It's warm." My breath caught. "You don't have to," Ella said. More to me than to him. There was a softness in the child's voice that didn't fit the place. He said to her, "She does. Sweetheart. Some things you can't just leave behind." His words felt like they were meant for me, and for something I'd been trying to ignore. So I did the stupid thing. Rolled my jeans, took off my shoes, and stepped into the pool. The cold came up like truth immediate. Searing. I kept my gaze on the bracelet. When my fingers finally closed around the tiny circle of beads, his hand was suddenly there. Palm extended. He took it from me as if it were fragile heirloom. Our fingers brushed. That touch was a spark. Ridiculous and dangerous. And I felt something shift in my chest. "You should take better care of what's yours," he said. And I didn't know if he meant the bracelet or Ella or me. I climbed out, wrapped Ella in a towel, someone produced from nowhere, and left with a thank you that sounded too small against the shape of the man. That night I told myself I'd quit. I would never go back. The next morning, the agency called. "He requested you," the woman on the line said, her voice flat as if she read the company manual. "He wants you again." Discreet. Of course. The word discreet felt like an exam I hadn't studied for. I imagined a line drawn behind me that, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. My hands were heavier than they should have been when I hung up. The money mattered, the job mattered, but so did that chill in my spine when I remembered the edge of his mouth, when he said, "You should take better care." That afternoon, I found myself back on the estate. I told myself it was because I needed the work. Because Ella needed her crayons. Because rent is a fact, and facts don't negotiate. I told myself a lot of things. The truth was simpler, and harder curiosity had become fate. When a man like that notices you, you don't just go back to dusting shelves and folding towels. You step into a story someone else has already begun to write for you. And suddenly, the margins of your life look different. I don't know if he meant to claim me that first day. Maybe he didn't mean anything at all. And everything at once. Maybe he liked the shape of the way I moved when I felt small. Maybe he liked the bracelet as a token. Maybe he liked the fact that I didn't look away. All I know is the world arranged itself a pool and a bracelet, and a word whispered into the air, and after that, nothing quite fit the way it had before. Curiosity had always been the thing that saved me in small ways. It got me this job. It got Ella the extra cookie. It kept me awake reading until dawn, when the apartment building smelled like frying onions and damp laundry. But curiosity is a different animal when it meets a man who lives in the dark and keeps his business in the mouths of other men. It becomes a thread. And once you follow it, you have to go where it leads. So I went back. Not because I thought it would be safe. Not because I thought I could control anything. I went because something in his voice had unsettled the part of me that had become hardened from scraping by. I went because I wanted to know what it was like to be seen, even if being seen meant stepping into a life that might take everything I had. By the time I walked through that gate again, the line between curiosity and fate had already blurred. The bracelet had done what it was supposed to. It had fallen so hard that the ripples reached me. They say danger announces itself with sirens and flashing lights. It didn't. Not for me. Danger came as a look that lasted too long. As a man who never raised his voice, but made the air around him thick enough to choke on. Once I'd crossed his threshold, the house rearranged the rules of my life. Work became surveillance. Chores became checkpoints. And the way he watched silent, patient, like a tide rewired the way I moved through the rooms. On my second day, I told myself I would keep my head down. I told myself I would fold towels and scrub silver and count each hour in small, safe increments. But the truth is, you can't clean a house without reading its faces. Adrian watched everything. Even when he seemed to be doing nothing at all. He stood in doorways like punctuation, arriving at the ends of sentences. He never gave orders loud enough to embarrass you. He asked questions that felt like examination. "You're not married." "Are you?" he asked. One afternoon, picking up a glass as if to examine the waterline. "No," I said. The word was automatic. The truth, tidy and flat. "What are you afraid of?" he asked later. When I was sweeping the hallway, it was the kind of question that wasn't about spiders or thunder. It was a soft knife. The air between us hummed like a live wire. There was chemistry, but it wasn't the glossy kind you see in movies. It was contained. Like a breath held for too long, it built in the spaces between cleaning and small talk. When I dropped a glass, an accident of tired hands, he didn't scold. He stilled my fingers. His touch was casual, but deliberate. A teacher correcting posture. For a long beat, we looked at each other. Nothing needed saying, because the silence said everything. His eyes were a map I couldn't read, and a language I might have learned if I stayed long enough. Then the universe tightened. I started noticing cars at the end of the block. A man with a baseball cap lingered near the agency office, as if he were trying on names for size. Small things that once floated by unnoticed stuck to me like burrs. One evening, 2 men shadowed me home. I told myself they were coincidence, bad timing. Wrong place. The city has people. I reminded myself, people with nothing to do. One of them stepped out of the shadow long enough to nod at me. There was a look between him and the other, a recognition that made my skin go cold. I walked faster. I checked the back seat of my car, like it might sprout hands. When I told the agency the next morning, the woman on the phone said, "Mr. Voss was concerned about your safety." "Isn't concerned," I echoed. The word landed and cracked. He wasn't concerned in the way a neighbor worries about a leaky roof. He was concerned in the way a man marks territory. Before I could refuse, a driver in a dark suit was at my door. His voice was neutral when he said, "Mr. Voss requests you remain available. For your safety." My stomach rolled. The line between being helped and being owned thrummed loud as an engine. When I returned to the house with Ella in tow, the place felt different, not colder or warmer, but more honest. Adrian didn't pretend the world outside didn't exist. He told me, lean and unreadable, about enemies and shipments, about men who kept tabs, and men who collected debts. He spoke with the flat cadence of someone describing weather matter of fact. Never surprised. Visibility gets people hurt. He told me, you becoming visible makes you a target. It would have been easier if he'd been cruel. If I could have hated him and walked away. Instead, he offered protection like a currency and expected me to accept the exchange. "You'll stay until I find out who followed you," he said. "It's safer here." Ella, who had begun to think of the marble baths and the high ceilings as an adventure, looked at him with the kind of implicit trust children place in strangers with kind faces. I thought of my neighbor and her warnings. I thought of the men who had trailed me. I felt the world shrink to the size of the choice in front of me, and fold closed. So we stayed. The house became a cage that smelled slightly of lemon cleanser and heavy perfume. Weeks slid by, with the soft rhythm of routine. Adrian's guards watched from behind the curtains like statues with radios. Meals were quiet. Ella reclaimed her laughter. She taught a stern maid how to braid ribbons and left drawings on the sunlit patio. In those small, quiet hours, Adrian showed versions of himself. He kept locked in rooms. No one else entered. He'd kneel on the patio and ask Ella about colours. About the big ideas 7-year-olds carry in their pockets. She taught him that the sky could be pink. Once, he bent close enough to see the way she shaded a cloud, and looked disarmed. It was the kind of thing that made me swallow hard because it felt tender and dangerous in the same breath. I began to see cracks in him, tiny fissures that let in the light. A softness when he watched Ella blow out a candle, a flat, haunted look when he thought of nights no one could name. He told me once, almost offhand, that he'd lost someone important long ago, words that slid into the conversation like a splinter. The monster people whispered about had pockets where grief hid, that made the rest of him more complex, not less frightening. We drifted toward each other like two ships pulled by the same current. The pulling wasn't dramatic. No sudden confessions or cinematic declarations. It was a hand placed on a shoulder that didn't leave, or an understanding in the way he would look at me when I spoke, like he was cataloguing what I said as if it were precious and fragile. "You scare me," I told him one night by the pool, the water reflecting the cold moon like a second sky. "Good," he said simply. "Fear keeps you alive." There was a pause, where the world seemed to hold its breath. "But maybe I don't want to be afraid anymore," I said, and the words felt like a dare. He didn't answer with a line or a promise. He stepped closer, until the light painted his jaw softer. And the space between us hummed with possibility. It was right there, an almost kiss. The kind that tastes like the truth you're not ready to name. It would have been a bridge between the inevitabilities of what we were, and the choices we refused to acknowledge. Then an alarm screamed. The sound ripping up like an animal. It broke the moment into sharp edges. Men shouted. Footsteps crashed in the hallways. The house I thought was safe, this glass and marble world that felt like a fortress, was suddenly raw and exposed. They breached the back fence. The room filled with the smell of smoke and the metallic tang of fear. I clutched Ella against me. Adrian moved like something rehearsed and brutal. There was a way he transformed in seconds, from the man who liked to trace the edge of a teacup with his finger, into the man who could make someone stop breathing. He positioned himself between us and the noise. A man went down. Then another. The sound of gunfire turned into an ugly percussion. The air was thick with dust, and the coppery scent of blood. I saw him then, as others had told stories, unflinching. Efficient. The soft mouth, hard as a promise. For the first time, I saw the two men exist inside him at once, the one who taught a child how to color the sky, and the one who wiped blood off his knuckles, and didn't flinch. He stood over a body, a small wound blooming dark on his shirt, and looked at me like the world could be remade in the fold of his palm. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice raw in a way I hadn't heard before. "You shouldn't make me feel safe." I answered without meaning to, and the honesty of it cut us both. Because he had made me safe, and because that safety came with a cost I didn't yet understand. When the last echo faded, and the house settled into a brittle sort of silence, I held my child, and listened to my own heart, loud and wrong in the quiet. Love and violence had braided together so tightly in those minutes, that I couldn't tell where one ended, and the other began. I had seen the monster, and I had seen the man. The knowledge didn't give me answers. It only asked a worse question. Which one would I learn to live with? Weeks passed like quiet little betrayals. The city kept turning. indifferent to the small catastrophic things that had happened inside its glass and marble heart. We left the mansion in the hush after the shots, taking only what fit in 2 bags, and what Ella could clutch without crying. Adrian was gone before dawn. No note. No explanation. Only the absence of the man who had been our storm and our umbrella. For a while, the world felt paused, like a breath held too long. Then it moved on. And we had to learn how to move with it. We found a house on the edge of town that smelled like old wood and rain. It was small and imperfect. The floors creaked, and the windows didn't quite close right. It had no guards. No marble. No servants with stiff collars, only a garden that needed a hand, and a neighbor who tended roses and sold eggs from a basket. Ella decided it was perfect, because she could draw there, without being told to be careful. She ran with a freedom I hadn't seen in months, chasing sunlight across the yard, and filling the house with crayon scribbles that taped themselves to the fridge, like tiny flags of normalcy. I told myself we were safe. I told myself that the men who had come were gone. That whatever war Adrian kept at bay had moved on. I tried to sleep without listening to engines on the street. I tried to let the small noises be ordinary a car. A night dug. The pipes, but safety, once learned in the shape of armed men and radios, is a fragile muscle. Every sound made me sit up. Every shadow on the curtains felt like a silhouette I recognized. I found myself listening for the cadence of his steps, the particular quiet he wore. I missed him in a way that made me ashamed. How could I miss the man who left blood on his hands and fear in my chest? But absence had its own gravity. And longing folded into the days like a second skin. Then, one Sunday, a car hummed down our lane and stopped. I saw it from the kitchen window while Ella colored at the table. The way the afternoon light turned the paint into a small sun. My stomach tightened before I even looked. I told myself not to go to the door. But curiosity is its own kind of hunger. I opened it without thinking, and there he was. He didn't burst through like something from my worst nightmares. He walked up the path as if he belonged in the world of ordinary footsteps. No suit. No entourage. Jeans faded at the knee. A shirt soft at the collar. He looked tired in the way people who have been awake for the wrong reasons look tired, edges frayed. A scar pale across his temple, like someone had tried to carve him down and failed. He was smaller somehow. More human in the way absence does to giants. You came back, Ella said before I could blink. Her voice had that unchecked honesty children have. There was no question in it. Only recognition. She ran to him and bounded up into his arms, like gravity had always known him. He laughed an unpracticed, astonished sound, and held her like she was the only real thing left. He looked at me. And in that look was the freight of everything that had been. I didn't think you'd let me, he said. Not a question. Almost an apology. He held out a small thing in his palm. When I saw it, my breath stopped. The bracelet. Its elastic had been restrung. The beads sat snug and neat like a small promise stitched together. You left this behind, he said. I fixed it. It was ridiculous to feel the chest clamp over a tiny loop of plastic beads. But I felt it anyway. I had thought I'd lost that small, pink thing in the pool, and with it, a part of the day that had changed everything. Seeing it in his hand felt like proof that nothing inside him had been as disposable as the world claimed. It meant he had thought of us not as collateral, not as tasks on a ledger, but as things that mattered enough to be tended. You don't owe me anything, I said, the words out before I could weigh them. They sounded like a law I wanted to enforce. He looked at me with a softness I'd only glimpsed in the margins before. I know, he said. But I'm done being afraid. There it was, the confession. That wasn't a confession. The rails that had kept him moving through the dark had started to slacken. He admitted no crimes. made no promises of cleansing. He only admitted exhaustion. I'm leaving the city. He added, I sold everything. I'm done with the parts of my life that only made other people suffer. I wanted to ask how you sell a life. And be sure you've sold it for good. I wanted to know if the men who had bled for him would accept a quiet life in the country as payment. I wanted to hear him promise that the past would stay in the past, and mean it. But I'd learned not to be naive about absolution. People who've lived with violence don't walk away cleanly. They carry it in the way they hold a glass, and in the scar that runs like a secret along their skin. He sat on the porch step like a man, tired of carrying the world in his hands. Come with me, he said simply. No flourish. No threats disguised as offers. Not because I want to protect you. Not because I want to buy your silence. Because I want peace. I want to learn how to be someone who can stay. Ella's small hand slipped into mine. A tiny anchor. There was a gravity in the decision that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with choosing the shape of the rest of your life. This choice was not about being rescued. It was about whether I would allow myself the possibility that someone who'd been broken could try to be less broken beside me. We left the city a week later. The drive out felt less like an escape, and more like a reorientation. He drove with a careful economy. I hadn't seen in him before. No nervous fidget. No constant checks. When we crossed into the green that wasn't concrete, the air felt fuller, as if the land itself could hold more than the city's hunger ever had. The cottage we found was humble stone steps. A sagging porch. A garden. He started right away, like some quiet penance. He dug with patient hands, planting things that needed tending. There was no grand gesture, only the slow work of building a life that might, in time, learn how to be gentle. Days passed in a rhythm that felt new to my bones. Ella chased butterflies in tall grass and taught him to make paper boats that she launched in puddles. Sometimes, I would catch them in the yard, the three of us slowing into a picture that had no headline myself, learning to breathe again in places where the air didn't taste like danger. He taught her that the sky could be pink if she wanted it to be. He didn't ask for heroics or apologies. He knelt beside her in the dirt, finding a small, private perfection in the way she pressed clovers into the soil. We rarely used the word love. It felt too big, too tied to movies of impossible endings. What we had was smaller and truer: an offer to stay. A refusal to leave when leaving would have been easier. Love, if you wanted to call it that, was the way he learned to be quiet in the mornings, while Ella slept. It was the way I let myself laugh at something small and see him respond without flinching. One night, long after the uproar and the alarms and the men with dark faces, we sat on the porch as the sky bruised purple. He turned to me, the light catching the line of his scar, and asked, "Do you ever think we deserve this?" I thought about all the nights I'd cried, soft into a pillow. About the breakfasts burned while I tried to pretend I wasn't thinking about the shape of a gun or the curve of his jaw. I thought about the men who had died and the way the world makes monsters of human beings. Deserve isn't the point. I said finally. We survived. That's enough. He exhaled. A sound like someone laying down a heavy pack. He reached for my hand and I took it, without measuring the cost. Maybe that was the only way to reckon with what had been done. Not by making lists of sins or promises that might crumble, but by accepting the odd, quiet truth that some things never heal completely, and that living with the unhealed is its own kind of peace. If you ask me now whether love fixed anything, I would tell you no. It didn't. It didn't erase the places where our bodies remembered violence, or the nights when my dreams tossed me into the same house with alarms. What love did was simpler and more dangerous. It let us exist with the pieces we'd broken. It let us choose, every morning, to stay, even when staying was a brave thing to do. Ella sleeps in the next room. Outside, the fields are quiet. and the wind moves through the grass like a long, thoughtful hand. Sometimes I think of the pool, and the tiny splash that started all of it. And I still feel a rush, the memory of a life, rearranged by the smallest thing. Sometimes I think of the men who won't forgive a man who tried to leave and shiver at the thought. But mostly, I think of small domesticities, the way he brings coffee on bad mornings. The way Ella insists the sky should be pink. The way the bracelet sits on my wrist like proof that we belong to one another, in a way that had nothing to do with ownership, and everything to do with choosing again and again. Love doesn't fix you. It doesn't seal wounds or promise that you'll never be afraid again. What it does, what it quietly insists on, is that you can live with what's broken and still choose to stay. If this story stayed with you, don't leave quietly. Subscribe. And tell me which part hit you hardest. If this story stayed with you, if you felt the heartbeat beneath the silence, don't just leave quietly. Tap that like button so more people can find it. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories that cut a little too close to the truth. Share it with someone who needs to hear that love isn't about fixing what's broken, it's about learning to live with it. And tell me in the comments, what part of Clara and Adrian's story hit you the hardest? I read every single one.